Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks podcast powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. Happy as always to have you on board of the podcast wherever and however you may be listening to the show. BYU closes out the regular season with their 10th victory. They take down the Houston Cougars 30-18 in Provo on a senior day evening that was freezing temperatures inside LaVell Edwards Stadium, but BYU gets it done and takes down the Houston Cougars. I'll unpack all of my thoughts here on this edition of the podcast, and you can follow me on social media at Mitch_Harper, and also subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. So BYU, the good news is that the Cougs are 10-2. The bad news, well, they're not going to the Big 12 championship game. It made for a weird evening, I got to say, inside LaVell Edwards Stadium, because 10 wins doesn't happen very often. You know, only the 19th time in 100 years of BYU football does BYU reach the 10-win plateau. And to do it in a power conference with one of the toughest strength of schedules BYU has ever had among the 10-win seasons, that's an impressive accomplishment. But at the same time, and even Kalani Sitake pointed out in the postgame press conference, they expected to win 2 more games and be 12-0 and be playing in the Big 12 championship game, but they didn't. And they lose those games to Kansas and Arizona State. They needed help from either Arizona or Kansas State. Well, that didn't happen, as neither of those teams won their respective games, leaving BYU to play against Houston for basically pride and to get that 10th victory. And it was pretty clear in the second half, coming out of the halftime locker room, when BYU realized that Iowa State beat Kansas State and that BYU was not going to play in the Big 12 championship game, it affected the way that BYU played in the second half. The second half against Houston was sloppy football. And you know, you want to chalk it up just solely to the being discouraged from not being able to go to the Big 12 championship game, but I was a little bit disappointed with the way that BYU played in that second half, and a lot of it centered on the offense. I just thought that the offense kind of looked lethargic. I thought the play calling was kind of predictable in stretches, and that they just weren't on attack. I loved what BYU did at the end of the second quarter, 2-minute drill once again. BYU's flying with the tempo. 52-yard completion to Chase Roberts sets up a BYU touchdown, and BYU's up 21-10 at the half. But in the second half, they kind of danced around, and they let Houston hang around to the point where, you know, in a stretch of the game, it was 24-18 after BYU goes 3 and out, and you're thinking, oh my, Houston might pull off the upset here. And that was a real possibility in that game. You know, the fumble, shotgun snap from Connor Pay to Jake Retzlaff, loose ball, Houston recovers. That was in the red zone. BYU's red zone woes reared its ugly face once again. They had a red zone appearance where they had to settle for a Will Ferrin field goal. They had a muff punt from Parker Kingston. Just overall, I thought BYU was not operating at a high level. And you thought that second half against Arizona State was going to carry over against Houston. It just didn't. And I kind of warned people in some of my interviews this week on the KSL Sports Zone that this was going to be a tougher game than people gave it credit for. I think a lot of fans look at this game and just go, oh, Houston's terrible. They're 4-7. They're the worst team on the planet. BYU should win 50-3, and that's all there is to it. And they should go to the 10th win, and that's that. There's never any sort of appreciation in college football anymore for just winning a football game. And look, Kalani Sitake was not thrilled with the way his team played, and I'm pointing out the flaws of how BYU played as well. But just to go into that game thinking BYU was just going to roll it up on Houston, that was a bit silly because from what we've seen out of BYU the past month, there was no indication that BYU was just going to go put up a 40-piece on a Houston who had one of the best defenses in the Big 12. Houston's got a really good defense, and if they keep that group together, next year they'll be one of the top defenses in the Big 12. I wouldn't be surprised by that. Willie Fritz is going to get them in the right direction. They will be a good football team in the near future in the Big 12 Conference. It's just going to take more time, and they've got to get things right offensively. Houston had the worst offense I've seen BYU face since Wyoming in Week 3. That was a terrible offense. And credit their interim offensive coordinator for throwing in a few new wrinkles and making it a lot more competitive than I think people thought it would be. But Houston is a far cry from the days of Andre Ware, Klingler, even Case Keenum. Even the years with Tom Herman. They had some great offenses. I always kind of associate Houston football with offensive play. It's nowhere to be found right now. It's all on the defensive side. But again, the defensive success from Houston led me to believe, and with the cold conditions, I thought BYU is going to probably be 21-10. That was my score prediction. And for a while there, that was the score, and it was 24-10. And BYU was kind of hanging around that mark. But it's tough to just blow out any sort of Power 4 team. And people coming away from this game feeling like BYU is down and out and they're a fraud. It's just, folks, how many Houston games have you watched? Actually watch these games. I could have told you that this was going to be a much tougher game when Houston held Baylor, one of the best offenses in the past 6 weeks in college football, to only 20 points. It was going to be a dogfight. Now, the knock you can have, though, on BYU's offense, the play calling was predictable, the execution was poor, and just the overall intensity from the team was lethargic. They seemed distracted. They seemed, at times, disinterested. And look, I understand there's going to be a little bit of a deflation from, oh no, we're not going to go to the Big 12 championship game. But to me, it's still college football. You're still putting out film for NFL scouts, and you still should want to get that 10th win. And you got the win, and you ultimately got it done. But to me, you wanted to get a little bit more momentum, I think, offensively heading into the bowl season. And, whoever you're going to face in the bowl game, I think you wanted a little more momentum offensively for that group. The defense is going to show up. As long as they have their personnel play in that game. Jack Kelly said in the postgame that he plans to play in the bowl game. Now, he's not sure whether or not he's going to declare for the NFL or not. Honestly, I think it'd probably be wise for him to do so. I think it would be smart. I think that he could be a drafted day 2 guy. His closing speed is elite. Jack Kelly is a beast. He will be a drafted football player, so I wouldn't blame him if he declared for the NFL after this year. But the defense is going to show up in the bowl game. Offensively, you just don't know what you're going to get week to week anymore. And that's a little bit worrisome going forward for BYU because you really thought that the issues from 2023 were well in the rearview mirror. And at stretches in the past five or so games, it's looked at times like last season's offense. Jake Retzlaff, 8 of 19, 167 yards, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 42% completion rate. He did have 9 carries for 57 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. That's an average of 6.3 yards per carry. It was interesting in the first drive of the game, BYU had that fumble. Crazy situation. LJ Martin, I believe Keelan Marion collided and then created the fumble, and Houston had a scoop and looked like it was going to be a score with a big man touchdown, but then Jake Retzlaff makes a great second effort, kind of like he did against Arizona State, a touchdown-saving tackle. But in the process, it looked like he kind of banged up his hand where trainers were kind of looking at that. He went into the medical tent during the first defensive BYU series, and then he came back for the second offensive series, and then immediately after that second offensive series, he went back into the medical tent, and throughout that entire time, he was in the medical tent and then came out for the third series. He didn't miss any game action, but you wonder if what the trainers were looking at had any sort of impact on the way that Jake Retzlaff was throwing the football. And he had some passes, once again, that were inaccurate. He had a deep ball to Darius Lassiter in the second half. Wide open, Lassiter missed him. Now, he had some receivers that did not do him any favors. There were a lot of drops on Saturday night. I liked the production that BYU gave to LJ Martin, 22 carries, 87 yards. And no surprise, BYU wins a ball game. Once he gets over the 20-carry mark, BYU is going to win football games with LJ Martin having success. I did, though, however, want to see more targets to Chase Roberts. Only 3 catches for 76 yards, only 4 targets. Chase deserves more touches, and it was noteworthy on Saturday night. He was part of the Senior Day festivities, and it's no surprise that he was part of that because a couple months ago he told the Royal Blue Collective that the Royal Blue Collective podcast that his mindset was to pursue the NFL after this season. To me, if I'm BYU, I'm putting all my chips into, well, I shouldn't say all my chips. I'm making a full court press to try to get Chase Roberts to come back for one more year because he could be one of the best receivers in the Big 12 next season. I don't know if he's going to be a drafted guy. I think he's an NFL player, and I think he's definitely elevated his NFL draft stock. My concern for Chase is that it's so hard in the NFL. There are so many receivers that are really good prospects. And you think about how good Puka was. Puka Nacua. I put Puka Nacua on a tier where he's one of the all-time best in BYU history. If he's not the best, he's number 2 behind Austin Collie. Puka Nacua was the 5th-round pick. Austin Collie, the greatest receiver in BYU football history, 4th-round pick. Now, it's not about how high you go, it's about the fit. And for Austin, it was a great fit in Indianapolis. He was with the Sheriff, Peyton Manning. And then for Puka, things broke his way. Cooper Kupp had an injury, and he formed a great relationship with Matthew Stafford, and a go-to guy was developed while Cooper Kupp was out, and Puka shined and just took off and ran with his opportunity and rewrote the NFL record books as a rookie. Those are 2 of the all-time greats. I wouldn't put Chase in, the top 5 or anything like that. He's a really good BYU football player, and I think he can only get better if he ran it back one more year. But will he? I don't know. The fact that he did want to go through Senior Day and pursue that, and he's made it pretty clear that his mind is kind of looking ahead to the future of pro football. If I'm BYU, though, I'm trying to get him back because, again, he could be one of the top guys for BYU and one of the top receivers in the Big 12 next year because he is a big play receiver. That 52-yard grab was top shelf. I mean, he makes tough grabs throughout the season. I mean, think about all the 4th down, the chain mover receptions that he has had. He added weight to his frame, and that's bore itself out. I mean, it's paid dividends because he has done a much better job catching passes in traffic this year against physical defensive backs in the Big 12 compared to last season. Chase is a special player. I think Keelan Marion's done a really good job. He's become a go-to guy on jet sweeps, 4 carries, 16 yards for Keelan. He had that slip in the red zone, as I noted earlier, that led to a Will Farron field goal attempt. He also had 3 catches for 42 yards and 4 targets for Keelan Marion. Kind of surprising, Darius Lassiter, no catches on the night. Granted, there was only 8 completions by Jake Retzlaff, and Darius Lassiter, his night on Senior Night was cut short. He got ejected from the game. Him and a Houston football player after Jake Retzlaff's final touchdown run. The Houston player pushed into Mata Avatase, and then Darius came in kind of retaliating, and they were shoving back and forth, and both guys got ejected after a little bit of a scuffle at the end of the touchdown. So kind of not the ideal night for how it finished off for Darius Lassiter, but Darius has had a highly productive time at BYU in his 2 seasons transferring in from Eastern Michigan. Speaking of the seniors, I thought Tyler Batty was brilliant on Saturday night. 9 tackles, 5 solo, 2.5 tackles for loss, 1 interception, 2 quarterback hurries. Batty was everywhere. I thought that was one of the great performances that he has had this season. I've said that probably about 3 or 4 times this year. He's had about a third of his games this year have been really good stuff. And, I asked Kalani in the postgame about Batty, and Kalani said that Batty should be an NFL guy. I'm really curious to see where he ends up as an NFL draft prospect. I believe Batty can be a 4th-round guy. I think at his position, the age will probably hit him a lot more than what a quarterback age would be, because it's been proven in the NFL you can be 40 and play at a high level at the quarterback position because of how they protect the QBs anymore with the rules favoring offensive players. Defensive end, though, it feels like that's a spot where you want younger. You want 21, 22, kind of develop them. Batty's an older prospect, but I think he's the type of guy, though, that can go into a camp and immediately be a factor. Maybe not a, first team, second team guy, but he's going to be on the 53. I feel like he's got a chance. So I'm curious to see how, he kind of closes out his BYU career, but he did a great job on Saturday night. And, it's interesting, too, watching him and Connor Pay and all these guys, because the BYU prospect, even without COVID, there are so many years invested into being a BYU football player compared to most programs. When you get a recruiting cycle at most places, the class is pretty much cycled through in 5 years. At BYU, it could span 8 years. Isn't that crazy? Tyler Batty signed in February of 2017. We're 3 months away from that being 8 years removed. He committed in 2016. That was 8 years ago. That was during Kalani Sitake's first year as a head coach. So Tyler Batty's seen a lot. He had a mission, he had a gray shirt, he had the pandemic, and then he had, 5 years with the football team too. So it's been a wild ride for Tyler Batty, but he's one of the all-timers. And you look at the stats, and, he's near the top 5 in sacks at BYU since the year 2000, when the NCAA started recognizing defensive stats. Batty's been a really good player, and I thought Saturday, in his final home game as a BYU Cougar, I thought he was excellent, setting the edge. I thought he was a real tone setter. I thought the BYU defense as a whole, they were put in some bad spots. The offense, the special teams were, kind of having their blunders, and defense always responded. I thought John Nilsson was really good. Blake Mangelson continues to be stout. Jacob Robinson, 4 tackles. Tanner Wall, 13 tackles on the game. Typically, you don't want your safety to have that many, but I think, the way they utilize their safeties, I thought it, was fine. BYU's defense was on point on Saturday night. Special teams outside of the Parker Kingston muff punt did a solid job, too. Will Farron's automatic. What a nice luxury BYU has with Will Farron, and he's still got 1 more year remaining. Farron is a stud kicker for BYU, and he's going to be a really good player for the Cougars next year into 2025. But how about the Talon Alfrey touchdown? Talon Alfrey, so BYU is down 7-0 early after Zian Chris gets a 3-yard touchdown run in the first quarter. Shortly after, on the kick, Houston squib kicks it, onside squib, and looks to try to pounce like Arizona State did on BYU, and it goes directly to Talon Alfrey once again like it did against Arizona State. Talon Alfrey was ready this time. He scoops it up, 58-yard kickoff return for a touchdown to tie up the game at 7. That was a big moment, because if, say, Houston just kicks it off and BYU's offense that was struggling and Jake Retzloff had just been in the medical tent, had they go back on the field and they're down 7-0, that's just a different feel. It kind of reminded me of the Utah game a little bit, where Utah got a lead, and then Keelan Marion popped off that kick return for a touchdown, and it was a tie ball game. And it kind of took a little bit of the pressure off the BYU offense to have an immediate response. And BYU's special teams this year have been brilliant. You talk about the scoring from that group. It's been a lot of fun to see. That was one of my bold predictions going into Cougar Sports Saturday on KSL News Radio on Saturday afternoon, was that the special teams was going to have a touchdown of some kind, whether it was return or whatever it may be. I probably didn't have on my bingo card Talon Alfrey being the guy to get that touchdown, but they pulled it off, and BYU tied up the game at 7. I also like Sione Aimoa. He got a 6-yard touchdown run in the second quarter. Sione Aimoa is going to be a really good player for BYU. I can't wait to see what he and LJ Martin become as a 1-2 tandem. Hinkley Ropati was a late scratch this week. It was kind of trending that way with Ropati, but then officially he was rolled out on Saturday. And Ropati's just always been hurt. And, to me, if you're BYU in the bowl prep, and I know Ropati's a senior and he probably wants to get that opportunity, but you just give the snaps to LJ and Sione Aimoa. Those are your top 2 guys. And then next year in 2025, I think you try to get a transfer portal running back, ideally, or you continue to develop the guys from within. I'm always of the belief that you want to add and continue to, bolster the depth and create competition and make guys always earn their spot every single year and get better. But LJ Martin and Sione Aimoa, that's a nice tandem. Moa, even though he was a walk-on freshman, he has shown that he absolutely deserves a spot on the 105-man roster, and he's got the potential to be a really special player for BYU. He just runs with so much intensity. He is a tough runner, and you pair that up with LJ Martin, that's a nice combination out of the backfield. So BYU, there were good things to be had, but when Kalani says we got to get better from this, like how do they respond in the bowl season? You're probably looking at the Alamo Bowl or the Pop-Tarts Bowl, one of those two. Both bowl games had representatives at LaVell Edwards Stadium for Saturday night's game against Houston, and both of those games are played on Saturday, December 28th, so you got about 4 weeks until that game takes place, whenever it happens. Selection Sunday will take place next week, and it'll be interesting to see how they structure the bowl practices and the bowl prep. The offensive line is going to be an area of focus to get that thing right, because that was a reshuffled deck on Saturday against Houston. You didn't have Isaiah Jada, who was banged up. Braden Keim continues to be out. Hopefully he could somehow return for the bowl game. Who knows if that actually will happen. You didn't have Austin Leausa. BYU was banged up, so then you had Waylon Lapuaho at right tackle. You had Caleb Etienne still anchoring down the left tackle spot. Left guard was Sonny Makassini. Right guard was Bruce Mitchell. And then center was Connor Pace. So you had a lot of guys playing in spots they had not played much of this season. And, the results were mixed, I thought, along the offensive line on Saturday night. Jake Retzlaff faced a lot of pressure. Not all the time. I mean, considering the circumstances, I'm willing to give the offensive line a little bit of leniency, but you hope that they can get a little bit healthier going into that bowl game, because if you draw, say, the Alamo Bowl against Colorado, and if Coach Prime is telling the truth that no one's going to opt out of that bowl game wherever and however they play in that game, you better be ready to face Colorado and play at your best. And honestly, I would be okay with that. BYU versus Colorado in the Alamo Bowl, sign me up. I'm there for that. I mean, that would be a really fun matchup. Shadur Sanders, Travis Hunter against BYU. I'd love to see that. BYU is going to play Colorado in 2025, but if that ended up being the game, I think that'd be a great matchup. But it was a good win for BYU on Saturday night, 30-18. No Big 12 championship game. That's a bummer for the Cougs. Iowa State and Arizona State, they're off to Arlington square off in the Big 12 championship game next week. But BYU turns their attention to signing day this Wednesday, and then bowl prep when that officially gets announced next Sunday for the Cougars. So that's going to do it for this edition of the Cougar Tracks podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. It helps out the show a ton, and I'll talk to you next time here on the Cougar Tracks podcast, and it's powered by KSLSports.com.